The other side of the greatest cinematic event of the year is Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. Coming out of the shadows of the pandemic and the implosion of his relationship with Warner Brothers comes a biopic of the father of the atomic bomb, Mr. J. Robert Oppenheimer. When it was first announced back in 2021, I was incredibly skeptical as to how someone like Nolan would tackle such a topic. A film based on the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, American Prometheus. Seeing someone like him doing such a film came off as very odd. Looking back at his movies, you could see a clear DNA and style to his films. His filmography consists entirely of thrillers and action spectacles. Adding something like Oppenheimer to the list makes it stick out a bunch. And I took it as a sort of a challenge for him, coming off Tenet, which looks, sounds, and even feels like the most Christopher Nolan movie yet, ended up being one of the weakest in his catalog. So him doing the complete opposite, a very dialogue-heavy 3-hour drama with presumably no action set pieces and limited flexibility in spectacle, I was kind of impressed that he had the audacity to push back on what makes his films his. And it's why, going into the new year, the movie was at the top of my list of the most anticipated films of the year, with an incredible amount of expectations for Nolan to recapture his place at the top of the industry. Now, having seen it, it more than exceeds my expectations. Oppenheimer is the incredibly dense biopic that I always expected it to be. Men and women having an exposition battle for 3 hours seems like a massive chore to sit through. But if there's anyone that has any experience in it, both good and bad, it's Nolan. Right from the get-go, you're thrown in a room with Cillian Murphy's Oppenheimer. And from that point on, I just got fully immersed in the film. The look, the anxiety, the claustrophobic room, it looked like it had the makings of a good biopic. And if it ended that way, I actually kind of would have been slightly disappointed, honestly. And I'm happy it didn't end like it. Through the first 10 minutes of learning and getting to know the psyche of Oppenheimer, it felt like the least identifiable of all of Nolan's movies. You could see the makings of it, from the impeccable sound design to the quietly harrowing score, much like most of his films. But the difference in genre and style of the film he usually makes, this kind of challenged a lot of his identity as a filmmaker. It's a kind of shift and deviation that I haven't felt since Interstellar, and that's saying a lot. With the book being as dense as it is, the film captures the heavy and brutalist tones it's partially adapting. From Robert's humble beginnings to his politician-like maneuvering between his talks with Matt Damon's Leslie Groves, it's very upfront yet tiring, I'd say, as every bit of information is necessary to the story, quite literally. And I feel like that's one of the few nitpicks I have with it. Once Oppenheimer is approached with the Manhattan Project, the film pretty much goes pedal to the metal with his story. The first 40 minutes felt like a very careful telling of who he is, and from then on out, the pace of the movie stays consistently fast and heavy, telling the story of the creation of the bomb. There's barely any breaks and strong development in other characters. And I would have accepted that until some of those characters that needed more fleshing out started to give extremely more emotional scenes towards the film's end, such as Emily Blunt's Kitty Oppenheimer, who had a very impactful exchange with Jason Clarke's Robert Robb, which could have felt more powerful had she been more prevalent beforehand. But again, I can't really knock it too much. This entire movie, even though it's people talking for hours on end, is so fascinating and engaging. And Nolan's DNA starts to bleed from constantly turning this from a historical biopic to a geopolitical courtroom drama and finally to a borderline thriller by the film's end. And that's thanks to the effort of everyone on this project, from the incredibly stacked cast along with Florence Pugh, Rami Malek, Josh Hartnett, Alden Ehrenreich, and of course Robert Downey Jr.'s Louis Strauss, who is just magnificent in the role, a show stealer, and your winner for Best Supporting Actor in next year's Oscars, as well as the technical attributes surrounding it. Now, Hoytma Hoytma pretty much goes all out, and that's kind of expected from him. It's all just beautifully shot, but I've gotta give my props to Ludwig Göransson. Now, I love Hans Zimmer's collaborations with Nolan. They're all iconic. But Göransson's score for this film is the best of his career, and probably my favorite of all of Nolan's films. It really reminded me of First Man, Theory of Everything, and hell, Interstellar. The roaring horns to the silent keys and the grand strings, it's perfect. absolutely perfect, and the run-up and the actual drop of the bomb was insane. It's beautiful, grand, and horror-infused at the same time. Now, I've seen some criticism about how it covers only his side of the entire story and not any of the Japanese, and I understand that, but this being a movie about Oppenheimer, that's not what this movie is for. A common thread throughout the whole film is how Robert constantly paints himself in the middle of the spotlight, never shining it on the victims of the tragedy. But I feel like that was on purpose. The movie is told in the first person, what he's thinking, what he's doing, and why he's doing it. He wanted to help champion one of the biggest achievements in the history of science, and I think that's the shocking and brutal sourness about it, not seeing what would have happened, blinding himself from the eventual event. Celebration and blood on his hands for what he created, and the butterfly effect it would have on the rest of the world. And this strictly being an Oppenheimer biopic, as heavy, draining, and dark as it is, I think it greatly succeeds in being just that. It's the kind of film from yesterday's Hollywood that we mostly never see in today's industry, and one that I think is going to be a turning point in the history of cinema. I'm feeling a strong 4.5 out of 5 on this. It's both Cillian Murphy and Christopher Nolan's career-defining moments, and rightfully so.